Hello, my name is Irene Fubara-Manuel. Today, my talk is titled The System is in Broken Race and Migration Algorithms. I have titled my talk after a chapter in Miriam Kaba's We Do This Till We Free Us, as I hope to sort of explain that the migration system is doing what the migration system should do, at least in terms of the algorithms. So I'm going to start off just briefly explaining a chapter that I wrote called Biometric Capture. It is not a chapter, it is an article that I wrote. It was published last year. I started this article talking about the first experience that I started thinking about colonization and race and capture, at least during my PhD. And this was when I was sat at the Nigerian High Commission in London, and I looked around the room and I found it quite interesting that we were all black and brown people trying to get this document that links us back to our home country in a country that used to have the same document, that used to actually issue to some extent the same document via the British colonial passports. So I found it quite interesting, and I started thinking a little bit more about capture, at least within the sense of how the Luz and Guattari frame it. For them, capture is a form of codification through the state. It is a turning of people, things, objects into things that the state can actually register and understand through science that the states can understand. So, for instance, land would be codified as property, people would be codified as migrants, citizens, so on and so forth. And this is where belonging sort of comes into, because again, what we're doing in that biometric capture room where we're trying to get our Nigerian passport is that we are trying to be codified via our belonging to Nigeria so that we can be able to sort of access other places in the world, more likely the UK. So I was in thinking of belonging, I wanted to sort of address a little bit how it is that belonging is codified to some extent. Black migrant belonging has been codified in the UK, at least in terms of legislature. And in order to understand belonging is first, we are coming through this branch of citizenship where we see the ways that citizenship was defined in one of the first British Nationality Act. It was one of the first legislatures to actually define citizenship. And this was post-World War II, where loads of colonial subjects, such as Canada, were trying to define their own national identity outside of just being British subjects. So for this reason, it was imperative to some extent that the sort of empire was rebranded. So you start seeing this use of British nationality for a bunch of people who were formerly British subjects. So the British Nationality Act essentially made it that people who were citizens of these colonies, whether it was Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Nigeria, India, one of the many British colonies, they would be able to have the same rights as the people who were born and raised in the UK. So that means that they would be able to travel, live, and work in the UK. And these people were called citizens of the UK and colonies. And this was through this British Nationality Act. As Ian Patel stresses in We Are Here Because You Are There, there's this narrative of the shortage of labor in the 1950s and the migrants that we now call the Windrush migrants because they came on the Empire Windrush. These were Caribbean migrants that were exercising their rights to come to the UK and work. There's this narrative that they were brought in as sort of labor shortage, but from what we see lots and lots of times through all the parliamentary debates, which is what I find quite interesting to pore over, is that there was a preference for white ancestral white European ancestral British visitors, migrants to come in. There was a preference, but what they got was the Caribbeans because they had every right to come here. So by the 1950s, 1960s, you start seeing these racial tensions. One on one end where the government itself starts, stressing, emphasizing this colored immigrant problem. And these sort of are brought up in debates in the House of Lords and House of Commons. And by 1962, the Commonwealth Immigrants Act is now enacted as a way to sort of separate people through ancestry. So those who have British ancestry will more likely be white in the Commonwealth were able to come to the UK and work and have the same rights as those with the British Nationality Act. But those who did not have British ancestry, who were more likely to be Indian, Black, African, Caribbean people, they were now required to have an employment voucher that sort of lets the immigration officials know that they have the right to come and work in the UK. By 1968, with the with the tensions rising in Kenya and East Africa, where a bunch of South Asians are being sort of pursued out of their own country, the UK sees that sort of refugee crisis in the making and sort of enacts another 1968 Commonwealth Act. So you have the 1962 and the 1968 Act, which again takes away more rights to abode, more rights of people to come into the UK and live here, because at that point, South Asians in East Africa were still citizens. They were still able to come into the UK. And in seeing the sort of rise of people coming in due to the fact that they were being kicked out of Kenya, the British government enacted this act that sort of made it even harder. So in this sense, you had to have patrial, which is a weird word, patrial lineage. So you should be able to trace your grandparents to the UK in order to come to the UK and work and live here. And from 1985, actually, we see the first time that the UK sort of places a visa restriction on the Commonwealth, a Commonwealth nation. And this was the ways that it sort of implemented a visa restriction for Sri Lankan refugees who were running away from civil war. They were trying to come to the UK as a haven. And the UK saw this and said, no. So they blocked them from coming in out of, the fact that, again, there's this issue of the colored migrant problem and more people are trying to come in and live here. By 1986, they made this even more formal by including 5 more other countries, by imposing visa restrictions on 5 more other countries. And this is where it becomes interesting, because the rationale behind these visa restrictions was that these countries, India, Ghana, Nigeria, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, had high rates of refusals at the border. So therefore, the high rate of refusal meant that they were not bona fide visitors. They had high rates of absconding and running away, even though they were very low statistics compared to the amount of people that were let in. So it was quite interesting because, yes, this high rate of refusal was now used as a way to sort of say these people are people that need to be policed. They are criminals. So therefore, we're going to impose restrictions on them. So now, in order to come into the UK, you do not necessarily come into the border. Instead, you apply for a visa in your home country and you're either denied or approved in your home country before you even step anywhere close to the British border. And this was a way that it sort of, that the UK sort of, demarcated even further this divide between the white Commonwealth citizens from the Black and brown Commonwealth citizens through this implementation of the visa regime. So as I just want to state some numbers here because I find it quite interesting from the Hansard, from the parliamentary debates, Kaufman states that Bangladeshis were 393 times more likely than Canadians to be refused admissions at the border. Maya Goodfellow writes in Hostile Environment, How Immigrants Became Scapegoats, that the rate of refusal for Black and brown Commonwealth people was 30 to 1 for the white Commonwealth people. So that means that 30 people would get refused. That means that they would get refused at an alarming rate. For instance, the Bangladeshi got refused at an alarming rate. And this was also because of the fact that the home officials were possibly even implementing, they were interpreting the rules, these laws that were being sort of, stated at their own discretion. So this means that a lot of white people from the Commonwealth were being let in, and then the black and brown people were being rejected. But this is quite interesting for me too, for the fact that this same logic is what is now operationalized in the 2015 to 2020 streaming tool implemented by the Home Office. And the streaming tool now takes this refusal rate to risk, feedback loop, and it expands on it. It makes it even more convoluted, as opposed to just this simple, your high refusal rate means that you're risky, so therefore you're not coming in. The streaming tool makes that even a lot harder. So according to the then Minister Carol Noakes, this was in 2019, the streaming tool was operated as decision-making centers in the UKVI, at the UKVI Visa and Immigration Services, as an algorithm, but it is not, according to Carol Noakes, it is not coding, it is not programming, it is not machine learning, and crucially, it is not automated decision making. So they wanted to make it very clear that this is not technological. In fact, the words that she used I find even quite funnier, because Carol Noakes states here that it is an automated flow chart. So it is it's a high tech flow chart. I have never heard of such a thing, but it was interesting for me, because it's all these ways that government sort of try to avoid regulating algorithms, all the ways that governments try to avoid accountability, but this time using technology and sort of saying no, we're not smart enough to be doing AI, and and using that to demarcate migrants. This was just low tech. So of course it will have problems. But as of today, as of the date that 2021, the Home Office has not released anything about this tool. All we know is just little scraps and pieces that we're able to put together from the Joint Council for Welfare for Immigrants and Fox Glove's sort of litigation against the Home Office, where they sort of outline a little bit of the process, and which is what I think is more of a reliable narrator. This legal document, which is dense and hard to follow, is more of a reliable narrator of the ways that the streaming tool works than the Home Office officials and the then immigration minister. So using the Joint Council Welfare for Immigrants document, I wanted to just lay out a little bit of how, in stages, according to them, the immigration streaming tool works. So the first stage sort of takes into account the Equality Act and Nationality Risk Assessment. So this is a document, again, that we have not seen, that I have not seen. I've been trying to find this document. So if anybody knows what it is, please let me know. But this lists out suspects' nationalities, and it rates them immediately as a red rating, which means that they were more likely to get refused. So immediately your country is on this the EANRA, which is what I want to call it now, out of repeating a long acronym. If your country is on this list as a suspect nationality, you would immediately get a red rating, and you would go into sort of this loop, pretty much, that takes you into a refusal, or this logic flow that takes you into high refusal rate, and therefore you have you're now assigned risk. The second step, if you're not already denied at this step, then they could take into account the GVRS, which is the Global Visa Risk Streaming Data. So what this is pretty much pretty much data collected about different countries, measuring the risk and the offenses that they have had against the immigration system. So it takes into account nationality again, where it is that these offenses are happening, the types of visas that these offenses tend to happen on, and that then gets input into the risk. At this point, if you have these three intersecting issues, where you're in the same country and you're in a particular location and you're applying for a particular visa type, you immediately would be getting the risk as either red, amber, or green, which is where the streaming tool sort of comes in. And this is the third stage of this process, where a caseworker would use a flow chart, which I'm assuming is what Carol Noakes is referring to there. The caseworker would use a flow chart, just answering yes or no, which would then result in a risk rating from the streaming tool. And this third stage sort of breaks people down into this traffic light system of a red, amber, and green risk rating, with red being the highest risk rating. So already off of this, at this point, a lot of greens would usually get approved. But if anything, if a decision can't be made at this point, they'll go through a process of enrichment, which is pretty much high scrutinization, where more information will be sort of, sourced out to make a better decision. And this process of enrichment usually is followed by another process where if a red rated applicant is not refused, that means if they are approved, it would get sent into an executive manager or an entry clearance manager or high executive officer who would look at this document and make the final decision making. This also applies for if a green applicant, so person that's good, is sort of denied entry, then that same process would happen. So that means that off of this pretty much flow, there's friction through this executive officer. There's friction because at this point, if you say no to an applicant who has a green rating, that means that you're probably making the bad decision. So friction, and executive manager is going to have to look at it. Or if you say yes to a red rated person, then problem. So again, it's going to go through this final decision maker. However, no friction if you just accept a green person or if you just deny a red person. So there's little friction because you're supposed to be doing what you're supposed to be doing. So you end up with a high rate of refusals for reds, which again feeds back into that risk rating system where they are now rated red. Because again, remember that the GVRS, the Global Visa Risk Streaming Data thing, it takes into account the nationality, the location, and the visa type in allocating risk. So if all of these people, if you have more people from a particular country being refused a visa, they are then sent again through that pipeline to become red. So if you are red, there is no way you're escaping that red loop. You're pretty much stuck in that feedback loop of being a red rated person. And this is quite interesting too, for the fact that although this tool does not mention nationality, it actually does not mention race. It actually is measuring race, because nationality, location, the type of visa, for instance, if we should take into account that people of color will more likely be applying for visas as well, as opposed to non-people of color, or white people. So it's kind of interesting because it doesn't say race, but it does race quite in a very convoluted way. So nationality, to some extent, it becomes a proxy for race. So this tool actually is discriminating based off of race. What else? So it comes as no surprise then that as the All Parliamentary Group for Africa reports in 2019 that African applicants were over twice as likely to be refused a UK visa than those from any other part of the world. So we still see that same sort of mistreatment of African migrants, Black and African migrants, that sort of starts off in the 1950s and 1960s up until now. So there's still that through line. So the Home Office, though they insist that the streaming tool is not ML, it's not coding, it's not an algorithm, it's not programming, it's nothing high tech, it's just an automated flowchart. Thus, again, this entire talk being done in a flowchart. Although they stated, I think it's still important that we sort of read this as a technology, because even an automated flowchart is technology. It could be software. It could be something that somebody might have done in Visual Basic, in what's it called, Microsoft Excel. It could have been something that someone did in JavaScript, in Electron or something like that. It could be something that someone has just a small system. Even though it's not programming, it could still be programming. And it's quite interesting too that the Home Office has been very clear that it's not automated decision making, it is not programming, and I think they should be challenged on that as well. Because again, if we should take in the account that code is law, and code is an interpretation of technology and law as well, and algorithms could be software, and algorithms could also be legal as well. So to some extent, the argument that you're making here is not necessarily the best, because it can still be read as an algorithm, because at the end of the day, an algorithm, or as they say, it is still an algorithm. And algorithms are pretty much, problem solving with a set of rules, right? So if we should take, for instance, Robert Kowalski's approach towards algorithms, where we see algorithm as logic and control, pretty much logic being something that states how what should be done to fix a particular problem, and control being how that would be able to sort of fix the problem. Then the visa allocation algorithm, the experimental algorithm, is pretty much a tool that has the logic of risk assessment, and then controls using visas, allocation, and refusals. So it's quite interesting, because outside of just looking at the logic and control, I think a bigger question to ask is, what is the problem behind that is being solved? And my argument here is that the problem that is being solved is not that of decision making, but instead it is the problem that starts off in the 1950s and 1960s, the problem of the colored, quote unquote, migrant. So this is then where we can sort of break out of the system. And I think this is why I like Miriam Kaba's word, jailbreak, because we jailbreak a phone, but we also jailbreak, as in break out of a prison industrial complex. So I find this quite interesting, because Miriam Kaba, Ruha Benjamin have both written about abolition and tech. And I find their work quite interesting for the fact, especially that Ruha Benjamin calls for a race-critical code studies, where we sort of look at technologies, we read the power structures behind technologies, and we don't only look at them as, simple, just technologies on their own or race neutral, but instead we look at them within the complex system of power that they are sort of engaging in. So it is under this sort of understanding that I want to approach a bottoms-up approach to sort of algorithms, where we are not necessarily looking at algorithms from the top down, where it is that a person in power is creating an algorithm, but instead thinking of inverting that dynamic and seeing what would happen if the people who are most affected by these algorithms design this themselves and create their own their own system. Actually, what happens if the people that are affected by this actually ask what the problem is, right? So they ask the problem, and they find out what the logic and the control to the algorithm pretty much to fix that problem would be. And in loads of cases, perhaps it's not even an algorithmic question. Maybe it's about scrapping the whole system. So it's on this note that I want us to end, because I think that it gives enough room for us to start thinking about algorithms from the bottom up, and jailbreaking algorithms, which I think would be good for our final for our workshop. So I'm happy to take any questions via email, I guess, up until the workshop date. And I'm hoping that having watched this, people can come into the workshop ready to sort of address this jailbreak system, and help me think through these ideas that I'm already exploring. Whether it is we just create our own automated flowchart. So thank you so much for coming to my talk, and I hope to see you all soon. Bye.